The rain outside made tiny tapping sounds against the windows of Golden Dragon Restaurant. Inside, the warm yellow lights made everything feel cozy and safe. The smell of fried rice and sweet and sour chicken filled the air, mixing with the soft sound of chopsticks clicking against bowls. Mrs. Chen walked through the front door at exactly 6:30, just like she had every Tuesday for the past 15 years. The little bell above the door made its familiar ding, and Tommy, the restaurant owner's son, looked up from behind the counter with a big smile. "Evening, Mrs. Chen," he said warmly. "Your usual table is ready." She nodded and gave him a gentle smile back. Mrs. Chen was 72 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a soft blue cardigan that had seen many years but was still clean and well-kept. Her walking was steady, but slow, and she carried a small black purse over her arm. The restaurant wasn't very big. Maybe 20 tables total, with red tablecloths and golden dragons painted on the walls. Most of the customers were regulars who came here because the food was good and cheap, not fancy but made with care. Tonight there were a few families finishing their dinner, an old man reading a newspaper while eating noodles, and a young couple sharing egg rolls. Mrs. Chen's table was in the corner by the window. It gave her a perfect view of the street outside where she could watch people walking by under their umbrellas. She liked this spot because it was quiet, away from the kitchen noise. She could see everything that happened in the restaurant. "The usual?" asked Amy, Tommy's sister, as she brought over a pot of hot tea. "Yes, please. And maybe some extra vegetables in the soup tonight," Mrs. Chen replied in her soft voice. She spoke English well, but with a gentle accent that told you she had learned it as her second language. Amy poured the tea into a small white cup, and steam rose up like tiny clouds. Mrs. Chen wrapped her hands around the warm cup and looked out the window. The streetlights made the wet pavement shine like mirrors. A few people hurried by, trying to stay dry. While she waited for her food, Mrs. Chen pulled out a Chinese newspaper from her purse. She unfolded it carefully and began reading, occasionally sipping her tea. The newspaper was from the local Chinese community, full of news about cultural events, family announcements, and stories from back home to anyone watching. She looked like what she was, a quiet grandmother enjoying a peaceful dinner alone. Her movements were gentle and careful. When she turned the pages of her newspaper, she did it slowly so it wouldn't make noise and bother other people. When she drank her tea, she held the cup with both hands, the way her mother had taught her. Many years ago, Amy returned with a steaming bowl of wonton soup. The dumplings floated like little pillows in the clear broth, surrounded by fresh green vegetables and thin noodles. Mrs. Chen thanked her and picked up her chopsticks. These weren't ordinary chopsticks to her. They were old friends. She had been using chopsticks since she was 3 years old, back in a small village outside Hong Kong where her grandmother first taught her how to hold them properly. Like holding a baby bird, her grandmother used to say. Yeah, firm enough so it won't fly away. Gentle enough so you don't hurt it. Mrs. Chen ate slowly, enjoying each bite. The soup was perfect, not too salty, with just the right amount of ginger to warm her up on this cold, rainy evening. She had been coming here so long that the family who owned the restaurant knew exactly how she liked everything prepared as she ate. She listened to the comfortable sounds around her. The soft conversation from the family at the next table, where a mother was helping her little boy use chopsticks. The gentle sizzling from the kitchen, where the cook was preparing someone's order. The quiet music playing overhead, old Chinese songs that reminded her of better times. Mrs. Chen had lived in this neighborhood for 40 years. She knew the shopkeepers, the postal worker who delivered her mail, and the young mother who walked by every morning with her baby in a stroller. This restaurant had become like a second home to her, especially after her husband passed away 5 years ago. Before that, she and her husband used to come here together every Tuesday. They would sit at this same table, share different dishes, and talk about their week. He would always order too much food, insisting they needed to try everything. She would laugh and tell him they couldn't possibly eat it all, but secretly she loved how excited he got about trying new things. Now she came alone. but the memories made the place feel less lonely. Sometimes she would order his favorite dish, sweet and sour pork, just to remember the way his face would light up when Amy brought it to the table. The restaurant family treated her with special kindness. They never made her feel rushed, even when the place got busy. They always saved her favorite table, and if someone else was sitting there when she arrived, they would gently ask them to move to another spot. Mrs. Chen never asked for this special treatment, but she was grateful for it. Tonight was quieter than usual. It's probably because of the rain. Mrs. Chen liked it this way. She could read her newspaper without distraction and enjoy her soup while watching the world go by outside her window. A cat ran across the street, quick and silent. A taxi slowed down, looking for passengers who might want to stay dry. She folded her newspaper to a new page and continued reading while eating. The story was about a community garden project where local families were growing vegetables together. It made her smile. Back in Hong Kong, her family had a small garden behind their house where they grew bok, choy, and herbs for cooking. Mrs. Chen was the kind of person who noticed small details, the way the light reflected off her teacup, how the rain made different sounds depending on whether it hit the window or the metal sign outside. The careful way Amy arranged the vegetables in her soup so it looked pretty as well as tasted good. She had learned long ago that life was made up of these small moments. A warm meal on a cold night, a comfortable chair by the window, the kindness of people who remembered how you liked your tea prepared. These simple pleasures had gotten her through many difficult times. As she finished the last of her soup, Mrs. Chen felt content and peaceful. The rain was still falling, but inside the Golden Dragon restaurant, everything was warm and safe. She had nowhere else to be tonight, and that was exactly how she liked it. She would finish her tea, maybe order a small dessert, and then walk the 3 blocks home to her quiet apartment, where she would read a book before bed. This was her routine, her small piece of happiness in the world, and she had no idea that in just a few minutes everything was about to change. The peaceful evening was shattered by the loud roar of motorcycles pulling up outside. Mrs. Chen looked up from her newspaper as 5 big bikes parked right in front of the restaurant, their engines making so much noise that the windows rattled. The riders turned off their machines. But the sudden silence felt heavy and uncomfortable. Through the rain-streaked window, Mrs. Chen could see 5 men getting off their motorcycles. They were all wearing black leather jackets and heavy boots. Even from inside, she could tell they were big men, the kind who took up a lot of space wherever they went. They stood around their bikes for a moment, talking and laughing loudly, not caring that their voices carried through the quiet street. The other customers in the restaurant had noticed too. The family with the little boy stopped talking and looked toward the window. The old man with the newspaper folded it and set it down, suddenly alert. The young couple sharing egg rolls moved closer together in their booth. Mrs. Chen had lived long enough to recognize trouble when she saw it. These men had a certain way of moving, a certain look in their eyes that said they were used to getting what they wanted. She had seen men like this before, back in Hong Kong, and later when she first moved to America. They were the type who believed that being loud and intimidating meant they were in charge. The restaurant door burst open with such force that the little bell above it rang wildly before falling silent. The 5 men walked in like they owned the place, water dripping from their leather jackets onto the clean floor that Amy had just mopped an hour earlier. The leader was the biggest of them all. He had a thick beard and arms covered in colorful tattoos that peeked out from under his jacket sleeves. His boots were heavy and left wet marks on the floor as he stomped in. Behind him, the other 4 spread out, looking around the restaurant like they were sizing up everything and everyone inside. "Man, I'm starving," one of them said loudly, his voice cutting through the quiet atmosphere like a knife. "This rain made me work up an appetite." Tommy, behind the counter, straightened up and tried to put on a welcoming smile, even though Mrs. Chen could see the worry in his eyes. "Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to Golden Dragon Restaurant. Table 4-5. The leader ignored Tommy completely. Instead, his eyes swept across the restaurant, taking in all the empty tables, all the quiet families, and finally landing on Mrs. Chen sitting peacefully by the window with her tea and newspaper. "That's the spot we want," he announced, pointing directly at her table. Right there by the window. Mrs. Chen felt all eyes in the restaurant turned toward her. She kept her face calm and continued holding her teacup, but her heart started beating. A little faster. She had been coming to this restaurant for 15 years, and this was her table. Everyone who worked here knew it was her table. Amy, who had been clearing dishes from another table, stepped forward nervously. I'm sorry, but that table is occupied. We have several other nice tables available. How about this one over here? She gestured toward a larger table that would actually fit 5 people much better. The leader looked at Amy like she had said something ridiculous. Did I ask about other tables? Said we want that one. He started walking toward Mrs. Chen, his heavy boots making loud sounds on the floor with each step. Mrs. Chen looked up as the 5 men approached her small table. Up close, they seemed even bigger. The leader had scars on his knuckles and a gold tooth that showed when he smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. The others formed a loose circle around her table, blocking her view of the rest of the restaurant. Excuse me, old lady, the leader said, his voice carrying a fake politeness that didn't hide the threat underneath. You're sitting in our spot, Mrs. Chen set down her teacup carefully and looked up at him with steady eyes. I'm sorry, but I was here first, she said quietly. There are many other tables available. Perhaps you would be more comfortable at one of the larger ones. Her voice was calm and respectful, the way she had been taught to speak to difficult people. She wasn't trying to start a fight. She just wanted to finish her soup and tea in peace. The man with the beard laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. Did you hear that, boys? The old lady thinks she was here first? The others chuckled along with him, but their laughter sounded mean and cold. Look, Grandma, another one said, leaning down closer to her table. This one had rings on every finger and smelled like cigarettes and motor oil. We've been riding in the rain for 2 hours. We're cold, we're wet, and we're hungry. And we want that table by the window, and we want it now. Mrs. Chen could feel the tension in the restaurant getting thicker. She glanced toward the counter and saw Tommy reaching for the phone, probably thinking about calling the police. Amy stood frozen with a tray of dirty dishes in her hands, not knowing what to do. The other customers were all staring, some looking scared, others looking angry, but not sure if they should get involved. I understand you're tired from your ride, Mrs. Chen said, still keeping her voice gentle. But I'm still eating my dinner. When I'm finished, you're welcome to have this table. The leader's fake smile disappeared completely. When you're finished? He looked around at his friends like she had said something unbelievable. Lady, you don't seem to understand the situation. Here, one of the other men, shorter, but just as mean-looking, reached down and deliberately knocked Mrs. Chen's newspaper off the table. The pages scattered across the floor, some landing in puddles of water that had dripped from their jackets. Oops, he said with a nasty grin. Looks like you dropped something. Mrs. Chen looked down at her newspaper, now wet and torn on the dirty floor. It was the same newspaper she read every week, full of stories about her community, her culture, her people. Seeing it treated with such disrespect made something stir inside her chest, but she kept her expression calm. That was unnecessary, she said quietly. Was it? The leader pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without being invited, his bulk making the small chair creak. Let me tell you what's unnecessary, old lady. What's unnecessary is you sitting here, taking up our table when there are 5 of us and only 1 of you. The man next to him started making comments about how old people should eat at home instead of taking up space in restaurants. Another one said something about how people from other countries should learn to respect Americans. Mrs. Chen had heard words like these before, many times over the years, but they still stung. Tommy finally found his courage and stepped out from behind the counter. Gentlemen, please, this is a family restaurant. The lady is a regular customer here, and she has every right to finish her meal in peace. The leader turned toward Tommy with eyes that had gone completely cold. And you have every right to mind your own business before you get hurt. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Tommy stopped walking, his face pale. Mrs. Chen could see that he wanted to help her, but he was scared. She didn't blame him. These were dangerous men, and Tommy was just a young man trying to run his family's business. Mrs. Chen realized that no one was going to help her. The other customers were too frightened. Tommy and Amy were too outnumbered. She was on her own, facing 5 men who had decided they could take whatever they wanted just because they were bigger and louder. But Mrs. Chen had been in situations like this before, long ago, in a different life. She knew that bullies like these only understood one thing. The question was whether she was ready to show them what that was. The restaurant had gone completely silent except for the soft sound of rain still tapping against the windows. Everyone was watching what would happen next. The family with the little boy had quietly moved their chairs closer together, the parents keeping their child between them. The old man at the corner table had his hand on his cell phone, ready to call for help. Even the sounds from the kitchen had stopped as the cook peered out. Through the service window, Mrs. Chen sat perfectly still in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. She looked small and fragile compared to the 5 big men surrounding her. But there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. A quiet strength that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside. The leader was still sitting across from her, taking up most of the space at her small table. He reached over and picked up her teacup, examining it like it was something interesting. "Nice cup," he said with a mocking tone. "Looks expensive. Be a shame if something happened to it." He held the cup up high, as if he might drop it. Mrs. Chen watched him calmly, but her jaw tightened just a little. That cup was special to her. It was part of a set her husband had given her on their wedding day 48 years ago. Only 3 cups from the original set were left, and this was one of them. "Please put that down," she said quietly. "It belonged to my husband, your husband," the man with the rings laughed. "Where is he now? Probably at home watching TV while his wife sits here being stubborn." Mrs. Chun's voice became even softer. "My husband passed away 5 years ago." For just a moment, something flickered across the leader's face. Maybe it was a trace of human decency, a small part of him that remembered what it felt like to lose someone important. But then his expression hardened again, and he set the cup down roughly on the table. Tea splashed over the sides, staining the red tablecloth. "Well, then he's not here to protect you, is he?" he said coldly. One of the other men, the one who had knocked over her newspaper, started going through her purse without permission. He pulled out her reading glasses case, her small wallet, and a photo of her and her husband taken at their golden wedding anniversary just 6 months before he died. "Look at this," he said, holding up the photo. "Sweet old couple. It's a bad granny here doesn't know when to give up and go home." Mrs. Chen's hands tightened in her lap, but she kept her voice steady. "Please don't touch my things." "Or what?" The man waved the photo in the air. "What are you going to do about it, old lady?" Amy, who had been standing frozen by the counter, finally found her voice. "Please, just leave her alone. She's never hurt anyone. Shh. She's like a grandmother to all of us here." The shortest of the 5 men turned toward Amy with an ugly expression. "Nobody asked you, sweetheart? Why don't you go back to the kitchen where you belong?" Tommy stepped forward again, his face red with anger and fear. "That's enough. I'm calling the police." "Go ahead," the leader said, without even looking at him. "By the time they get here, we'll be long gone. But maybe we'll take Grandma here for a little ride first. Show her what happens to people who don't know their place." The threat sent a chill through the restaurant. Several customers were now reaching for their phones, but Mrs. Chen could see the fear in their faces. They wanted to help, but they were scared of what these men might do to them or their families. The man with the beard stood up from his chair and walked around to Mrs. Chen's side of the table. "You know what your problem is, old lady? You don't understand respect. In our world, respect means knowing when you're beaten." He reached down and grabbed the back of her chair, tilting it slightly so she had to grip the armrests to keep from falling. All you had to do was move to another table. But no, you had to be difficult. Mrs. Chen looked up at him with steady eyes. "I asked you nicely to leave me alone." "I asked you 3 times. 3 times, he laughed. "Well, aren't we keeping count? What happens now that we didn't listen to you 3 times? Another one of the men had picked up her soup bowl and was examining it like he might throw it on the floor. The soup was still warm, and steam rose from the surface. "This smells terrible," he said. "How can you eat this stuff?" "It's good food," Mrs. Chen said simply. "Made with care by good people." "Good people?" The man with the rings made a disgusted face. These people aren't even from here. They should go back where they came from. The words hit Mrs. Chen like a slap. She had been hearing comments like this for 40 years. Ever since she first came to America as a young woman with her husband, they had worked hard, learned English, paid their taxes, and tried to be good neighbors. But to some people, they would always be outsiders. "This is where I come from," she said quietly. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years. I've watched children grow up, seen families come and go. This is my home." The leader grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her thin cardigan. "Not anymore, it's not. Time for you to find a new place to eat." He started pulling her up from her chair, but Mrs. Chen didn't move. It was as if she had suddenly become much heavier, rooted to the spot like an old tree. "I said get up," he growled, pulling harder. Still, Mrs. Chen didn't budge. There was something different about her now. The scared, helpless old woman seemed to have disappeared, replaced by someone else entirely. Someone who had made a decision. "Let go of my arm," she said, and her voice had changed too. It was still quiet, but there was steel in it now. The man ignored her and tried to lift her bodily from the chair. That's when Mrs. Chen did something that surprised everyone in the restaurant, including herself. She stood up, but she didn't stand. Up the way a scared old woman would stand up. She rose from her chair in one smooth, flowing movement like water turning into steam. Her back straightened, her shoulders squared, and suddenly she didn't look small anymore. The man holding her arm felt the change immediately. What had felt like grabbing a fragile bird now felt like trying to hold on to something made of steel cable. "I asked you nicely to leave me alone," Mrs. Chen said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that filled the restaurant. "I asked you 3 times, you didn't listen." The 5 men looked at each other uncertainly. Something had changed, but they couldn't quite figure out what. The old woman standing before them looked the same, but she felt completely different. "So what?" the leader said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. "You think standing up makes you tough?" Mrs. Chen looked at each of them in turn, her eyes taking in their positions, their stance, the way they held themselves. She was reading them like a book, and what she saw told her everything she needed to know. "I think," she said softly, "that you've forgotten something very important." "Yeah, what's that?" Mrs. Chen's eyes went completely calm, like the surface of a deep lake. "You should never judge a book by its cover." That's when the leader made his biggest mistake. He decided to show this stubborn old woman exactly who was in charge. He drew back his hand and reached out to push her hard, thinking that would finally make her understand. He had no idea that he was about to discover just how wrong he was about everything. The moment the leader's hand came toward Mrs. Chen, something extraordinary happened. Time seemed to slow down in the little restaurant, like someone had pressed a slow-motion button on the whole world. Mrs. Chen moved. But she didn't move like a 72-year-old grandmother. She moved like flowing water, like wind through trees, like something that had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. Her right hand came up in a gentle circle, catching the man's wrist as easily as catching a falling leaf. The leader felt his hand stop in midair, held by fingers that looked delicate but felt like steel bands. His eyes went wide with surprise. Tried to pull his hand back, but it wouldn't move. It was as if his wrist had been caught in the world's gentlest but strongest trap. "What the?" he started to say, but Mrs. Chen wasn't finished. With her left hand, she placed her palm against his chest, right over his heart. It looked like the softest touch, like a grandmother patting a child. But when she pushed, just a little bit, the big man stumbled backward 3 steps and sat down hard in an empty chair, looking completely shocked. The restaurant was so quiet you could hear people breathing. Everyone stared at Mrs. Chen, who was standing calmly by her table, her hands at her sides, looking like nothing unusual had happened at all. The leader looked down at his wrist, then at Mrs. Chen, then at his friends. "Did you see that?" he whispered. The man with all the rings stepped forward, anger replacing his confusion. "You got lucky, old lady. Let's see you try that again." He rushed at her, his hands reaching out to grab her shoulders. Mrs. Chen waited until he was almost touching her, then stepped to the side so smoothly it looked like dancing. The man's hands grabbed nothing but air. and his momentum carried him forward into the table where he knocked over the salt and pepper shakers. But Mrs. Chen wasn't done with him. As he stumbled past her, she placed one finger against his back, right between his shoulder blades, and gave the tiniest push. The man went forward like he'd been hit by a truck, landing face first in a booth on the other side of the restaurant. The family sitting there quickly moved out of the way, their eyes wide with amazement. Da-da-da-da-da-da. The little boy tugged on his mother's sleeve and whispered, "Mommy, how did the nice lady do that?" Two more of the bikers looked at each other and charged at Mrs. Chen from different directions, thinking they could overwhelm her with numbers. This time, Mrs. Chen didn't even look worried. She seemed to know exactly where each man was without even turning her head. The first one came from her left. Mrs. Chen ducked under his reaching arms and swept her leg in a small circle. The man's feet got tangled up with each other, and he fell to the floor like a tree that had been cut down. He wasn't hurt, just completely confused about how he'd ended up on the ground. The second man came from her right, moving fast and looking angry. Mrs. Chen turned toward him like she was greeting an old friend. She caught his arm as he swung at her, guided it in a gentle circle, and somehow used his own movement to spin him around 3 times before he collapsed into a chair, dizzy and disoriented. Through all of this, Mrs. Chen's breathing never changed. She wasn't sweating or breathing hard. Her hair was still neat. Her cardigan wasn't even wrinkled. She looked like someone who had just finished arranging flowers, not someone who had just handled 4 big men without breaking a sweat. The last biker, the shortest one who had been making mean comments about immigrants, was backing toward the door. His tough guy act had completely disappeared, replaced by pure fear. "This is impossible," he kept saying. "This is impossible." Mrs. Chen looked at him with kind eyes, like a teacher looking at a student who had finally learned an important lesson. "Nothing is impossible," she said gently. "You just have to understand that things aren't always what they seem." The leader was still sitting in the chair where Mrs. Chen had put him, staring at her like he was seeing a ghost. "Who are you?" he whispered. Mrs. Chen walked back to her table and sat down in her chair like nothing had happened. She picked up her teacup, which was somehow still full of warm tea, and took a small sip. "I'm just a grandmother who wanted to finish her soup in peace," she said simply. Tommy behind the counter was the first person to move. He walked slowly toward Mrs. Chen's table, his mouth hanging open in amazement. Amy followed him, carrying a new newspaper to replace the one that had been scattered on the floor. "Mrs. Chen," Tommy said softly, "I had no idea you could do that." Mrs. Chen smiled at him, the same gentle smile she had given him when she walked in an hour earlier. "There are many things about people that we don't know just by looking at them." The man with the rings was picking himself up from the booth, moving very carefully like everything hurt. The one who had fallen down was getting back to his feet, looking around like he couldn't quite remember how he'd gotten on the floor. The dizzy one was still sitting in the chair, holding his head in his hands. The leader finally stood up, but he didn't look angry anymore. He looked embarrassed and confused and maybe a little bit scared. "How did you do that?" asked Mrs. Chen set down her teacup and looked at him thoughtfully. "The same way you learned to ride your motorcycle. The same way Amy learned to cook. Same way Tommy learned to run this restaurant. Practice." "But you're just a little old lady," one of the others said. "Yes," Mrs. Chen agreed. "I am a little old lady, but I'm also other things. It's just like you are other things besides motorcycle riders. People are complicated. They'll have stories that others can't see just by looking at us." The bikers looked at each other, not sure what to do next. Their whole plan had been based on intimidating someone they thought was helpless. Now they didn't have a plan at all. The leader cleared his throat. "We should go," he said to his friends. They started walking toward the door, moving slowly and carefully, like they were afraid Mrs. Chen might change her mind about letting them leave. As they reached the entrance, the leader turned back. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'm sorry about your newspaper. And your tea. And, well, everything." Mrs. Chen nodded graciously. Apology accepted. "Drive safely in the rain." The 5 men left the restaurant much more quietly than they had entered. Through the window, everyone could see them getting on their motorcycles, but they weren't laughing and shouting anymore. They looked like people who had learned something important about making assumptions. As the sound of their engines faded into the rainy night, the restaurant slowly came back to life. The family with the little boy applauded softly. The old man at the corner table raised his coffee cup in a small salute. Other customers began talking quietly among themselves, their voices full of amazement and respect. Amy brought Mrs. Chen a fresh cup of tea and a new bowl of soup to replace the one that had gotten cold during all the excitement. Tommy straightened up her table and brought her a clean newspaper. "Thank you," Mrs. Chen said, as if they had simply helped her with her coat instead of witnessing something that would be talked about in the neighborhood for years to come. But everyone in the restaurant knew they had just seen something special. They had seen that sometimes the most ordinary-looking people are hiding the most extraordinary secrets. After the motorcycles disappeared into the rainy night, the Golden Dragon restaurant felt different. The air seemed lighter, like a storm had passed and left everything clean and new. But there was also a sense of wonder hanging in the room. As if everyone had just witnessed something magical, Mrs. Chen sat peacefully at her table, sipping her fresh cup of tea like nothing unusual had happened. She had folded the new newspaper neatly beside her bowl and was eating her soup with the same careful, graceful movements as always. To look at her now, you would never guess that just minutes ago she had handled 5 grown men like they were children throwing a tantrum. The other customers couldn't stop staring at her, but they were trying to be polite about it. The family, with the little boy, kept whispering among themselves. The old man at the corner table had ordered another cup of coffee, just so he could stay longer and maybe understand what he had just seen. Even the young couple who had been sharing egg rolls earlier were still sitting in their booth, their food forgotten, looking at Mrs. Chen with complete amazement. Tommy stood behind the counter, cleaning the same glass over and over again without realizing it. His mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened in his family's restaurant. Amy was wiping down tables that were already clean, moving closer and closer to Mrs. Chen's corner, clearly wanting to say something, but not sure what. Finally, Tommy set down the glass and walked over to Mrs. Chen's table. He pulled out the chair across from her, the same chair where the biker leader had sat so rudely, and asked quietly, "Mrs. Chen, may I sit with you for a moment?" She looked up from her soup and smiled. "Of course, Tommy, please." He sat down carefully, like he was afraid the chair might break. For a moment, he just looked at her. This woman he had known for years, was trying to match the gentle grandmother in front of him with the person who had just done the impossible. "Mrs. Chen," he said slowly, "I've known you for 15 years. Been coming to our restaurant since I was in high school. You've watched me grow up, helped me with my English homework, given me advice about college and girls and life. But I never knew." He trailed off, not sure how to finish the sentence. Mrs. Chen set down her spoon and looked at him with kind eyes. "You never knew what, Tommy? I never knew you could do what you just did." "How is that possible?" Mrs. Chen was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the rain. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear, carrying a weight of memory and experience. "Tommy, do you remember when you were learning to drive? How scared your parents were to let you behind the wheel of their car?" Tommy nodded, confused by the question but trusting that it was leading somewhere important. "They were scared because they saw you as their little boy, even though you were 17 years old and taller than your father. They couldn't imagine that their little boy could handle something as powerful and dangerous as a car. But you could, couldn't you? You had been preparing for years, watching, learning, practicing in your mind." "Yes, but that's different. That's just driving." Mrs. Chen smiled. "Is it? Tommy, people see what they expect to see. When your parents looked at you, they saw their baby boy taking his first steps. When those men looked at me tonight, they saw a helpless old woman. But we are all more than what people see on the surface." Amy had been listening from a nearby table, and now she came over and sat down next to her brother. "Mrs. Chen, what Tommy is trying to ask is, how did you learn to fight like that?" Mrs. Chen picked up her teacup and held it with both hands, feeling its warmth. "Fighting," she said quietly, "is not what I learned. What I learned was how to protect myself and others. There's a big difference." She looked around the restaurant, at all the faces watching her with curiosity and respect. These people had become her family over the years, and she realized it was time to tell them a story she had kept to herself for a very long time. When I was a young girl in Hong Kong, she began, my father owned a small shop in a neighborhood. That wasn't always safe. There were gangs, and sometimes they would try to take money from the shop owners. My father was a gentleman, like your father, Tommy. He didn't want to fight anyone. But he also didn't want to lose his business or put his family in danger. She paused to take a sip of tea, and everyone in the restaurant leaned in closer, even the customers at other tables straining to hear. So my father found a teacher. It's an old master who lived above a tea shop 3 blocks from our home. This master taught something called Wing Chun, a style of Kung Fu created by a woman for women, but useful for anyone who wasn't as big or strong as their attackers. Tommy's eyes went wide. You learned Kung Fu? I learned many things, Mrs. Chen said with a gentle smile. I learned to move like water, to bend instead of breaking, to use an attacker's strength against them. But most importantly, I learned patience and control. The goal was never to hurt anyone. The goal was to end conflicts quickly and safely. Amy shook her head in amazement. How long did you study? The 23 years, Mrs. Chen said simply. From the time I was 8 years old until I got married and moved to America with my husband. The old man at the corner table had given up all pretense of not listening and had moved his chair closer. 23 years, he repeated. That's longer than my grandson has been alive. Mrs. Chen nodded. By the time I stopped training, I was teaching other students. Young women who wanted to feel safe walking home from work. Fathers who wanted to protect their families. Shop owners like my father who needed to defend their businesses without becoming the kind of people they were defending against. Tommy was doing math in his head, so when you came to America, ... I was already a master. Mrs. Chen finished. But America was different. This country gave me a chance to be just a wife, then a mother, then a grandmother. I didn't need to teach anymore. I didn't need to fight anymore. I could just be normal. She looked around the restaurant again at the golden dragons painted on the walls, at the red tablecloths, and the warm lighting that made everything feel like home. When my husband and I started coming here, I was happy to just be Mrs. Chen, the quiet lady who likes wonton soup. Tommy, your father never knew my story. Your mother never knew. Even Amy doesn't know, or didn't know until tonight. It that way. Amy reached across the table and gently touched Mrs. Chen's hand. Why didn't you ever tell us? Mrs. Chen's eyes grew distant, remembering. Because I came to America to leave that life behind. I was Chen Liming, the Kung Fu teacher. Here I could just be Mrs. Chen, who reads Chinese newspapers and drinks tea and watches the rain. It was peaceful. The family with the little boy had been listening to, and now the father spoke up. But you still remembered how to do it. After all these years, Mrs. Chen smiled. Some things you never forget. It's like riding a bicycle or swimming or speaking your first language. The knowledge stays in your muscles, in your bones, waiting. Tommy leaned back in his chair, trying to absorb everything. So all these years, while we thought you were just a sweet old lady, I was a sweet old lady, Mrs. Chen corrected gently. Still am. But I was also other things. We all are, Tommy. You're not just a restaurant owner. You're also a son, a student, a dreamer, a friend. Amy isn't just a waitress. She's an artist, a daughter, a young woman with big plans for her future. People are complicated, she finished. The last of her soup, and folded her napkin neatly beside her bowl. Tonight, those men needed to learn that you can't judge people by what you see on the outside. Sometimes the smallest person in the room is the strongest. Sometimes the quietest person has the most to say. Sometimes the most ordinary-looking person has lived the most extraordinary life. The little boy from the family table had been listening. With wide eyes, now he walked over to Mrs. Chen's table, looking up at her with pure admiration. Are you really a Kung Fu master? He whispered. Mrs. Chen looked down at him with twinkling eyes. I'm really a grandmother who knows how to make bullies go away, she said. Is that close enough? The boy nodded eagerly, then ran back to his parents, chattering excitedly about the superhero grandmother, as Mrs. Chen stood up to leave. Every person in the restaurant stood up too. applauding softly. It wasn't loud or showy. It was the kind of respectful applause you give to someone who has just shown you that the world is more mysterious and wonderful than you thought. Tommy walked her to the door with her umbrella. "Mrs. Chen," he said, as she prepared to step out into the rain, "will you still come back next Tuesday?" She looked at him with surprise. "Of course. Where else would I go for the best wonton soup in the city?" As she walked away into the gentle rain, Tommy watched her go. This woman who had been part of his life for so long, who he was just now really meeting for the first time. She looked like the same Mrs. Chen as always, a small, elderly woman walking carefully under her black umbrella. But now he knew that sometimes the most amazing people are hiding in plain sight, waiting patiently for the moment when the world needs to see who they really are.